Welcome to Truth and Justice League podcast. I'm Mark Mueller, and this is my special guest, Jim Morris.
Thank you, Mark.
Jim, you are a journalist and work in the environmental and workplace safety zones quite a lot. Tell us about your group, Public Health Watch, and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I've been a journalist for 47 years now, about half of that time in Texas. I started Public Health Watch a little over 4 years ago now. It's a nonprofit investigative news organization based here in Austin. And we do everything from environment to workplace to lack of access to care. And our specialty is deep reporting on topics that others tend to shy away from or simply don't have time to do.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Give us some examples of some work that you guys have done that kind of skated past the mainstream coverage of things that you're interested in talking about.
Sure. Our big project this year, which came out in March, is a podcast called Fumed. And that's to be taken literally and figuratively because it's about Channelview, Texas. You probably know where that is.
Oh, yes.
On the San Jacinto River, about 15 miles east of downtown Houston. And the interesting thing about this podcast, we've had 4 episodes so far, and there'll be a couple of more before the end of the year. In fact, I'm doing one next week. I'm recording one next week. What's different about it is our lead reporter, David Leffler, basically embedded himself in this community. Channelview used to be kind of a middle-class, working-class white community predominantly. Say 40 years ago, it is now predominantly low-income and Latino. So it's demographically, it's flipped. Meanwhile, the San Jacinto River has become basically a parking lot for chemical barges. I don't know if you've been over there recently. But
I have not been.
Out of control. It's essentially unregulated by the state or the feds. And these barges carry some of the most dangerous chemicals on the planet. And, should a hurricane blow through there or should there be some other sort of, accident, you can imagine what will happen. I mean, that river has already literally caught fire. We're talking about a few decades ago. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. So the podcast, Fumed, profiles 2 longtime residents. And what's interesting is these are older, white, conservative people. They're Trump supporters who, the last thing they ever wanted to do was become environmental activists. But they both lived in Channelview for a long, long time, going back 30, 40 years. And they've watched what's happening on the river, and they've become increasingly alarmed and, frankly, pissed off about just the lack of control of these chemical barges. So they have become unlikely activists and are starting to record some sort of small victories. So those are our 2 main characters. And then there are, ancillary characters and so forth. But it is done really well. It is available on the NPR app, Spotify, Apple, but it has done especially well on the NPR app. And it's our first podcast, so we're quite proud of it. And, it can cross the political spectrum. You don't have to be a Greenpeace member to appreciate it. You could be a Trump supporter and still relate to these 2 people.
Well, that's one of the things I want to talk about because we at Truth and Justice League, we're for humanity, and we're for the earth, and we're for humans, and it's a nonpartisan issue. We all have to breathe, and we all want to survive, I think, and want our children to survive in a less toxic environment. And so, how do we get there from here? Is kind of that's one of my regular topics of conversation. Just to orient the people a little bit. I used to live in Houston and went to law school at the University of Houston, and so we were familiar with what they then called the ship channel. And at that time, there were a number of refineries and plants down there. Of course, that was it's a big oil and gas refinery area, shipping area, and we would hear things from time to time about toxic stuff. And I remember hearing, oh well, it's levels are below EPA level of no danger. Communities don't have to worry whenever there would be sometimes there would be explosions or there would be releases of stuff in the air, and there would be sometimes evacuations of people, and then the news reporting would be very dramatic about that, and then they would say officials now are telling people it's okay to go back to their houses, and there's no public health danger, and that was a repeated mantra. Maybe you've seen that before.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I worked at the Houston Chronicle for 9 years, from 1990 to 99, so I know exactly what you're talking about. And in fact, one thing I forgot to mention about this community Channelview, apart from the barges, is there's a chemical storage site there that has been poisoning that community for now 2 decades with high levels of benzene, which, as you know, is one of the worst carcinogens, causes leukemia, lymphomas, and other things. And the state of Texas has just sort of sat by passively and not cracked down on it. So we did that story too. That was the sort of outrageous fact that drew us to Channelview in the first place. So we did a long written investigation talking about the high benzene levels for 20 years or almost 20 years, and the state just saying, well, no problem here. And that in turn led to the podcast.
Do you also work in print journalism, online journalism, or what do you do?
We're mostly digital, but we work a lot with public radio. We have a really close relationship with Texas Public Radio, which is based in San Antonio. They're helping distribute the podcast, the Fumed podcast. We work a lot with Spanish language media because so many of these areas, including Channelview, are now majority Latino. And my feeling is if we're going to do a big investigative piece in a majority Latino community and just publish it in English, who's going to see it? I mean, what's the point? It could be the best writing, could be the best investigative work on the planet, and if nobody reads it, so what? So we have all these partnerships now with Univision, including in Houston, San Antonio, and then other parts of the country. And those have gone really well for us. We're getting this sort of urgent information to the audience that needs to hear it in their native language.
I want to follow up with you on that, and particularly after this program is over with, because one of my interests is getting this information out to people, and also to coordinating with lawyers to do things to file injunctions or to bring cases against some of these places to get things cleaned up, or to recover for the immune diseases, cancers, respiratory problems, et cetera, that just seem to be epidemic out there. So, and you're right, we're looking at these often are, this is not a politically correct conversation to have, I guess, these days, but historically, when you go into these industrial areas, historically, they do tend to impact lower economic groups and racially disparate groups predominantly. I've seen it over and over again. I've also seen a tendency, particularly in the South, places like Mississippi and other. That's just one state, but places that don't have a strong independent government and that don't have a wealthy and powerful, citizenry, and they get pounded because they get. Yeah. We see it in Louisiana, for example. Yeah. That's everybody knows about Cancer Alley, and I used to have an office in Lake Charles, and I looked at cases down there from time to time that were going on with chemical releases and things like that. And what I saw down there was a pattern of plants that either came from outside the country or they came from the Northeast or the Midwest, and they'd kind of worn out their welcome down there in those places. And there was cheap land, and there were governments were relatively easy to get deals with. They were eager to have businesses and jobs and the tax base and to be honest, there's a lot of backdoor dealing going on. And then all of a sudden you've got this, kind of horrific situation. And that's one of those things where you go, how can this go on this long in this country? I am friends with a group in Louisiana called Rise St. James. Mm-hmm. Again, largely predominantly African American groups in southern Louisiana that are they're all fence line communities that are just right next door to some of these just huge refineries and chemical manufacturing plants and methane plants and things like that. And they're just getting dosed. And they've been getting dosed for a long, long, long time. The laws and the politics have made it very hard for these people to do anything about it. That's part of the problem.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a little bit about, I know you did something else. You developed an app for people to be able to look up chemical stuff.
Yeah. It's a tool called fencelinedata.org. It's still very much work in progress. We're adding new data sets to it, but it went live, I guess, last year. And again, it's just fencelinedata.org. And it uses EPA data, but makes it, toxics data, greenhouse gas data that most regular people and even some very experienced people would have trouble finding on the EPA website, especially now. It might even be gone from the EPA website, right? Or soon may be gone. It makes it easier to use. It makes it easier to understand. It's meant for not only journalists, but just the general public. But it is still a work in progress, and we hope to add some new features to it before the end of this year.
I commend you for doing that, because I know that it's getting, in a way, easier to find information now that we have internet, but it's also not easy, and it's a maze of things to get through, and it's a maze of things to understand. What I'm seeing a real need for is, and I say this all the time, the government's not going to save us. Big corporations are not going to save us. It's not in their financial interest as they see it. I think it would be if they got the full picture of how much damage they've really done and were held accountable. But there's not an incentive for them at this point in time, either one of them, to put the money and the time into solving these things. So it comes down to people like you and Public Health Watch and citizens and lawyers and community people to arm themselves with information and then to look for opportunities where they can do something about this.
Yeah, and we're starting to see a little bit of that in the, in the Corpus Christi area. I don't know how closely you followed the petrochemical build-out down there.
Oh, very closely. Well, pretty closely.
Yeah, I mean, it's going crazy down there, just as it is in Beaumont, Port Arthur, and in Harris County, and pretty much the whole Texas coast with the petrochemical, just insane build-out. And the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality virtually never denies a permit for a plant to expand or for new construction. If a petrochemical company wants to come into a particular community, they come in, and they usually get tax breaks to do it too, which is ironic and pretty sad for these smaller communities.
I'm seeing that down in the Rio Grande Valley too, even further south, because I've got good friends that are down there, and they are, that's the more pristine part of the coast. Very still people fishing and surfing and boating and things like that down there. And years ago, that was a sleepy, kind of quiet area. They first got problems with chemicals from those plants that were right across the border, that were across the Mexico border. And now it's come to this side too. And what I'm seeing is people are very concerned because they're building these huge, huge natural gas plants and different kinds of, I call them loosely refineries, but they're chemical places. And the companies go in and they steamroll these places. They just overwhelm the local politicians, and the state has not been very active in controlling anything from that level, and neither have the feds. So we get a real problem.
There is a little bit of hope, and we're going to be exploring this next year. And again, this is mainly in the Corpus area, although it may be going on elsewhere. And that is, people have gotten sufficiently pissed off, especially in these once rural communities like San Patricio County, if you know where that is,
yes,
just north of Corpus, where they've already got a massive Exxon joint venture with the Saudi government, an ethane cracker. Put that in probably 4 or 5 years ago now, and came in to this sort of sleepy rural community and promised, guess what, jobs, right? Because that's what they always do, right? If you let us build this thing, or if you give us incentives to build this thing, it'll create all sorts of high-paying jobs. And as you probably know, it doesn't happen very often. It might create 10 jobs for a multi-billion-dollar plant. But the one positive thing, and again, Public Health Watch will be exploring this next year, is people have gotten sufficiently annoyed about this that they're starting to run for local elected office, city council, county commission, school board. And it's not just progressive. It's not just what you and I would think of as, traditional environmentalists. Some of these folks are conservative ranchers who also don't like what they're seeing. So if there's a ray of hope, I think it's probably, at least here in Texas, maybe around the country, it's at the local level.
I see. I don't see this as a partisan issue. It's not Republican. It's not Democrat. It's not conservative versus liberal. And that's one of the things that it kind of gives me hope, particularly in Texas. Texas is a big state. It is a bigger than life state, And one of the things that drew me to Texas in the first place, I'm from Wisconsin. What drew me to Texas was, they let me into law school at the University of Houston, and it didn't cost that much, so I was really grateful for that. But the other part was, it seemed like a state that was so independent, and they let people do their thing. Okay, so you could go down here, and you could create your business, or you could create your profession, and basically, people would judge you for what you did, and I liked that. I liked that independence that was going on, and I think that may be the key in how Texas could start taking control of this, because there's a lot of people, a lot of the damage is done in the city, but a lot of damage is done in the rural areas with the oil and gas and the refineries and things. They're building up over and over again, and it affects huge amounts of land and water, which are both important. So what are you seeing? You mentioned something about running for local office. One of the things that we're talking about for Truth and Justice League is people want to know, what can we do? As we tell people, hey, it starts with us, and it goes from there. And so one of the things you mentioned was, run for local office at school boards and local county boards and local mayors and things like that. Just do it. And another thing is, how do we get these communities, or how do these communities organize themselves? What do they do?
Yeah, it's really tough, as you know, especially in those areas that, and I'll come back to San Patricio County, a once rural, area with more cattle than people, right? And now all of a sudden, all these companies are eyeing it for more and more of these chemical facilities. It's tough. I don't think Texas is a terribly well organized state. I think in some ways Louisiana is better, maybe because it's been so bad over there for so long. You mentioned Lake Charles, and of course we all know about Baton Rouge and that area. And this is just anecdotal. I don't have data to back this up. It just feels to me like Louisiana is a little bit better organized than Texas.
Well, one of the things I saw in Louisiana that was pointed out by the Rice St. James folks was that there was a group of physicians that started to get organized about trying to protect public health. And as a rule, physicians come with a high level of respect and a fair amount of access to power, a fair amount. I'm not trying to overdo it. But when they get interested in making things safer for people and kids, they tend to get a more welcoming voice, be more welcoming ear, I should say, of politicians. And so they've had a good luck with getting bills passed to do screening and evaluations and tracking of of health trends and things like that. That's great because they're getting a voice, and that's where it needs to come from all places. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, workers, lots of groups. Because I know from lawyers' standpoint, boy, we're the last people they listen to because they consider us to be the threat, and because we're lawyers, we will sue people, and so we have a bad reputation, but we're also really needed, and I think more and more lawyers are needed to step into the environmental and regulatory divisions.
Journalists are right down there with you in terms of these days.
Right.
I'm not saying we should be. I'm saying a lot of people think we're the enemy too.
Well, that's probably why, as you know, I've always gotten along with journalists.
Yeah, no,
that's
great.
From my old days at the Beaumont, running down with the Beaumont Enterprise crew and those folks, and Kevin Carmody and all those guys. Journalists, I always consider journalists to be kind of the kindred spirits of social justice. They don't go into journalism to make money.
Definitely not.
Yeah,
Definitely not.
People could say that about lawyers. They went into it to make money, and some of us do. But some do, and some make a lot of money. But often when you scratch the surface of these folks, it's at the end of the day they go, "What am I doing for humanity?" And we need to all do more. And we can't do it alone. It's got to be a building of coalitions.
I have a question for you, if I can turn the tables. One of the stories that we want to do, it'll probably have to be next year, we're just kind of running out of time, is how hard it is in Texas to win a toxic tort claim, and how the courts have been stacked against plaintiffs.
Yes.
Whether it's workers or just citizens, right, over the last, 20, 30 years? I'm curious to hear how you would describe that phenomenon and what impact that has. Well, let me just tell you what I think.
Yeah, go for it, and then we'll get into it.
I think because these companies in Texas know they don't have to worry a lot about being sued. I guess unless maybe they kill somebody in an explosion or something, they don't have to worry about people who live around their plant who might be exposed to benzene or something else successfully pressing claims against them. That removes an incentive to watch what they're doing, to control what they're doing. But anyway, that's something we want to explore next year, but I'd like to hear what you think.
That's a great topic because it's no secret among the lawyers in the community that there's a number of things that have gone into this. There is, law is an evolving process. Laws get passed all the time, and there was a big wave in Texas, in probably about the time frame you're talking about, to have what they call tort reform, which is it's not a good thing. When you hear tort reform, it sounds good because of course we want to reform things, but what tort reform really means is that the people that have damaging businesses, damaging practices that are poisoning our people or that are injuring people through negligence, they get a pass, either a complete free pass or they get limited liability responsibility. And in Texas, that one wave that has happened is laws being passed that allow there to be limits placed on lawsuits or on the financial responsibility for corporations in terms of how much responsibility they have to be proven to collect anything. That's one level. So there's a big barrier at the very beginning. And then there are also statute of limitations problems, which are statutes of limitations are the time from which a person needs to file a case from when either the negligence happens or the injury happens. And that is, in most cases, a car accident case or somebody, loses an arm because of some malpractice or something like that. Well, you kind of know when that was anyway, But toxic cases is a different ballgame because those are typically long latency, slow developing situations where the first problem is in looking at it is am I really sick? It takes a while for cancer to develop or immune problems to develop, at least be noticeable. And by the time people realize that they have something, they're maybe not even sure where it came from. So that's one problem. But by then, it's years have gone by, and the companies, if you try to bring a case, they're going to say, well, you should have known that way back then, and you're too late. That's one problem. But then, and these are legislative laws that then get interpreted by the courts. And we've had a sea change in courts, and this is largely appellate courts. So it's the courts of appeal and the Supreme Court have been increasingly active in limiting lawsuits and increasing the effect of legislative laws through their interpretation. So that's happening a lot. And we're in a kind of a sweet spot here, not a sweet spot in the environmental area, because we also have science to play with, okay? That is what's causing these things and how much exposure is needed to say that it caused this particular injury. Well, that is such an evolving field. There is so much dispute over things like how dangerous are chemicals. And there's so much lobbying and misinformation and disinformation and propaganda that goes on. There are these big chemical lobbies, and there are these big groups that are basically putting out pro-industry chemical documents constantly, and they sound great. It could be, I'm making up the names here, but it'd be the American Society for Safe Chemicals or something like that. But it's purely owned by industry, but they look great. It's like, wow, these are experts. They're telling us this stuff is safe. So there's a huge problem everywhere. There's a huge problem everywhere, but it's particularly a problem in Texas because it takes a long time for certain chemicals to even get on the radar screen of the regulators, and a lot of corruption in that arena. And then when you get there, you got to deal with courts and expert witnesses and restrictive rulings from courts on who can testify and what they can testify about. And it's a dynamic and complicated field because things that we now see as obvious, 5, 10, 15 years ago, people were just like, well, that's not related. Even simple things like asbestos and smoking. Those seem so obvious now, right? Mm-hmm. But at one time, yep, and not that long ago, these were being promoted. I keep old cigarette ads because they're promoting it for women that were pregnant, helping to calm their nerves. Mm-hmm. And they were promoting it with doctors and athletes and celebrities. But on the background was all this science stuff. So I guess I'm kind of getting off track here, but in Texas, one of the things that they, as in the establishment that was involved in this, have been very effective at is controlling the higher levels of courts, and getting the courts to make very restrictive rulings on things like what is the required level of proof to prove that, say, for somebody was injured by benzene or asbestos or some other chemical. That's an area that has to be addressed by legislation, first of all, because if legislation changes it, the courts will follow to a degree. And so legislation's got to get out there. And that's where it can't be a partisan issue, because we need to have laws that are changed to make justice more accessible to people. We're poisoning everybody. That's just kind of a fact.
Isn't it true that you could have two identical cases? Let's say they're benzene exposure cases, one in Texas and one in Illinois. And the odds of success for this, same facts, totally same exposures. Yeah, explain why you'd have a much better chance in Illinois than you would in Texas.
Oh yeah, so the laws, the legislative laws are better. the appellate courts are less restrictive. And to give you an example, it all comes down to what level of proof is required, and then whether there's a restriction on the types of experts that can testify, and whether there's a restriction on the amount of damages that can be recovered. Also, whether or not there's an application of the statute of limitations that's favorable or not. In some states, it's very much favorable. They will like, well, you don't have to file the case until you have reasonable reason to make a connection between the injuring actor and your health condition. And then there's in many of these states, it will be if you can show that the company or the corporation was a cause of the injury, then they can be found responsible for sometimes the whole judgment, which is very helpful. And to me, that's the way it should be. It should be kind of a role reversal where if you've been injured by a chemical or a combination of chemicals, it's kind of like you just prove you were injured by those chemicals and then let the other side figure out who's responsible for what portion of it is the way it should be. But there's a huge difference. We take cases in other states that we wouldn't take in Texas. Mm-hmm. The facts are not different. This is stuff where we need grassroots help. And we really need a fresh breed of legislators. And I'm not saying throw everybody out, but people need to be aware that they have a responsibility to their citizenry and to the safety of all of the citizens. And that's not working.
Don't you think this is, do you think this is a disincentive for polluters in Texas to, they're not afraid of the TCQ. They're certainly not afraid of the EPA, especially now.
Right.
And if they don't have to be afraid of a massive lawsuit, of a huge judgment or settlement or something, doesn't that just make it easier
completely
for them to pollute?
Without a doubt. And just to give you two key examples is Louisiana and Texas, side by side, and both of them are bad places to file toxic cases. Louisiana has very restrictive workers' compensation. We can talk about that a little bit, what protects the worker. But they also have a really harsh statute of limitations. It's like 1 year on most things. And by the time you blink, 1 year's gone.
Yep.
So without a doubt, that's why they're expanding down here. And I think that's why you see much more expansion down here than you do in places like California, for example, or Washington State, or Illinois, or Massachusetts. Some of these states used to be big industrial states.
Right.
And I think they were able to see what it did. And then they diversified their economy. Mm-hmm. And now they're looking at residue of all the stuff that has happened. Texas and Louisiana were relatively young in this field. Relatively young. I mean, there have been refineries here for a long time, but as you've seen, the explosions happened, and it is, but it's like there is a energetic block in the world about these, because it seems to me so obvious. We have to do something about this. You can't just continue to dump all this stuff into the air and the water and to pretend it's not bad. I remember, back when I used to live in Houston, and I went to Louisiana a lot, had a little office in Lake Charles for a while. And this was back in I'm an old guy now, right? So this was back in the early 80s. I would go from Houston to someplace in Louisiana. It could be Lake Charles, could be New Orleans, could be Baton Rouge. But I literally rode, Highway 10 all the way, and from downtown Houston, you go past those areas you're talking about, and in Houston, and then you go past Port Arthur and Beaumont and Orange and Lake Charles and Baton Rouge, and there are just smokestacks. There were smokestacks everywhere, and there were fumes. I remember crossing the bridge into Louisiana, into the Lake Charles area, and you could smell. I mean, you could smell the chemical stink in the air, and it was undeniable. That's what's going on, and it's still there, and it's getting worse.
Later this year, I'm working on a story we have a really very talented data journalist, and she's going to play a big role in this, but we're going to try to show in a simple and yet compelling way how crazy this petrochemical boom is in Texas by using, graphics, data visualizations. Most people don't respond well to spreadsheets, including me. I find them impenetrable and pretty boring. And I think that's fair. I think
Yes.
that's fair for most ordinary people.
Oh, I don't want to look at it.
But she's already created, these are some kind of test graphics based on toxics data and greenhouse gas data and, construction permits and all that stuff. And it will just blow you away when you see it. It'll be toward the end of the year. There might be some general knowledge that things are going crazy in this state. Certainly people like you know what's going on all the way from Orange down to Brownsville, right, in terms of these build-outs and these expansions and so forth. But our hope is to present this information in just a kind of a visually interesting or maybe scary, depending on your viewpoint, way. So people in Texas and around the country can see just how nuts it is. Because if you just look at numbers and reports, it means nothing. Unless you live in one of these communities, then it means something. If you live in Nederland or Port Neches or one of these, or Port Arthur, one of these communities that are seeing more and more infrastructure, sure, it means something to you. But the rest of the state's like, no, that doesn't affect me.
I'm with you on this one, and I would like to do another show with you or your person to do this, because I think that the visualizations and art and music are the keys to this, okay? Something that can be shown in a matter of seconds to minutes that is visually grabbing and memorable and simple. Take it one step further. We have at Truth and Justice League, we've done art projects with some of my friends who are really, really good artists. And I've asked them to demonstrate by art both a problem and a solution and what it looks like visually. And we would like to take that much broader. We would like to see murals on big buildings and billboards all over the country that show where we are and where we can be. One tension that we have to work with here is this stuff is nasty, and it can be very fear-inducing. People are bombarded with fear to the point where they are paralyzed and they can't motivate to do things. So part of the challenge here is to present the information in a way that is clear but doesn't paralyze people, because we're so dominated by social media and mainstream media stuff constantly, and you just don't want to see any more bad stuff. After a while, people tune it out. I've noticed that. I mean, if I post something up that is related to toxins, I don't get very much response. If I present a visual, I get a little bit more response. If I present a picture that has actual people in it, I get a little bit more response. If I present a scientific article, nobody looks at it.
Yeah.
And it could be really important. I try not to post bullshit.
Yeah.
Because I see a lot of information. I'm like you. I see a lot of information in the toxic field. I see a lot of medical and scientific information. I have friends that are high-ranking scientists all around the world that know what they're talking about. And so some of this information, I think people should be aware of it. They should know it's in their water.
Right.
and not just keep drinking it, but it's hard to stay on top of this. How do you stay on top of it?
We can't, of course. My inbox every day is flooded with emails about new studies. This causes such and such in kids or pregnant women or elderly people with COPD or whatever. But to your point a minute ago, I do think you have to give people hope when it's legitimate, not fake hope, not Pollyanna crap. But I wrote a piece for the Dallas Morning News, an op-ed last month, August, about a case. You may have heard of this. The big Exxon Baytown complex. One of where Baytown. Right?
Oh yes.
And the refinery is like 100 years old, and then they've got a chemical plant there, and it's. I believe that the footprint of that facility is 4 times the size of Central Park in New York. It for a long time was the biggest manufacturing facility, not just chemical manufacturing facility, in the United States. I'm not sure whether it still is, but 15 years ago in 2010, you know what citizen suits are, right? You can bring a citizen suit under the Clean Air Act,
Sure.
Clean Water. So 15 years ago, some folks from Baytown, a few residents who were tired of having this stuff dumped on them, especially through the air, got a couple of public interest lawyers and filed a citizen suit against Exxon for literally thousands of violations of the Clean Air Act over a period of, I want to say, 8 years. And predictably, Exxon fought them, because that's what Exxon does, right? And initially, Exxon won the case in federal court. It was tried before a judge, not a jury, in Houston. And then the plaintiffs appealed, the environmental folks appealed to the Fifth Circuit, I guess it would have been. And then they won. They won. The Fifth Circuit sent it back to the Houston trial judge. Anyway, Exxon just kept losing after that and kept appealing and appealing and appealing. And the amount of money involved, the fine that would have been involved was, for Exxon, it was pocket change. I forget the exact amount. It was in the millions, but that's nothing. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle. And then finally, so this went on and on and on. And finally this summer, June 30th of this year, Exxon was trying to get it in front of the Supreme Court so they could knock out the whole concept of citizen suits, not just get rid of this meager, for them, penalty. They didn't. Again, the money was not the point. The point was we need to get rid of these pesky citizen suits, these annoying
little ants,
people.
These ants.
And as you know, citizen suits are supposed to be brought when the regulators don't do their jobs. In this case, the state of Texas mainly. So on June 30th of this year, the Supreme Court declined to take the case, and the case, after 15 years, is finally over. And Exxon will have to pay its penalty, and again, I forget the exact amount. It's in the millions. But that was the piece I wrote for the Dallas Morning News, said, hey, every once in a while the little guy can win. It took them 15 years, but they beat one of the biggest oil companies in the world. So
that what you're mentioning there, and that's, boy, justice is slow. Right, that's 15 years of stuff, and that is a hard way to go. Federal court is tough. In general, it's tougher because those are appointed judges, and they tend to be relatively rigid, But and the Fifth Circuit is not considered to be a haven for these kinds of lawsuits.
Not just the opposite.
And neither is the Supreme Court of the United States. So. Right. So that, I have actually some hope that by things like this, that the judiciary and the conservative judiciary could end up being allies to us if they start doing things that make sense. They have a lot of power. And I don't know how it's all going to play down here, but I don't think it's as completely simple as people want to make it, liberal, conservative kind of stuff, because that was a Supreme Court that is quite conservative, and they didn't take it.
Right. And the other thing that attracted me to this particular story was the Fifth Circuit Exxon kept losing in the Fifth Circuit, which, as you say, is not exactly a pro-plaintiff court. It's considered a pro-industry court, isn't it?
Sure.
By
Yeah.
reputation. It's not
Yeah.
the Ninth Circuit or something. So the fact that Exxon kept going to the Fifth Circuit, and the Fifth Circuit kept saying, no, you know.
Yeah, I'd like that. I want to encourage that. I want to encourage these decisions that are. I mean, that's an obvious one to me. It's an obvious one. Is that citizens in that view should be able to do these things, and there was merit to it. And I want to commend and encourage these judges to do that. I'm not going to vilify the Fifth Circuit or Supreme Court for blah blah blah. You know, I encourage them when they make good decisions, and I encourage them to make better decisions in the future, all the way down the line, and stop voting. One of the things that really bothers me about politics right now, and Supreme Court's kind of politics, but it's not really pure politics, but is how our Congress and U.S. Congress and our state legislators function. Often, absolutely, regardless of the issue, pure party lines. Mm-hmm. That's just crazy. Why would there just be a purely partisan vote on virtually any of these topics? Because it's not that way. It shouldn't be that way.
No. So again, we're not trying to give people false hope, but we do try to highlight things like that Exxon case. You know, when it is a legitimate victory for, you know, the ordinary person. Mm-hmm. And we'll be doing more of that too. And as I said earlier, we'll be doing more of that in the Corpus area, where people are starting to push back against these big chemical companies.
People do need to get out there and become more active in making the laws and in being in situations where they're able to control things like permits. But the other thing that really is really important to remember is we need these jury trials because the citizens actually, when you get a group of citizens, for the most part, and give them a chance to make a decision and give them even complex facts, they can usually get something that is reasonable, even in complex matters. I mean, I'm not one of those people who go, oh, well, you got to be a lawyer or a doctor or a scientist to be on a jury. No, people's life experience matters. And the more juries that get to hear some of these cases and hear really the bulk of the evidence and let the jury decide, not just cherry pick this or that. We gotta get access granted to these juries. Somehow the system has got to be opened up so that these are more and more available to people. Jim, one of the things that we have discussed is the workers in America, and industrial workers, whether they're working refineries, steel, petrochemical, whatever, has been really the backbone of a lot of modern American industry. And what people don't know, unless they've been in those industries, is how hazardous that work is. I know you've written a book, and I know you've done a whole series of articles about the workplace hazards and the workers themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that? Start it however you want to.
Happy to, Mark. This is one of my passions as a journalist. As I mentioned earlier, I've been in it for 47 years now, since 1978. And having worked in places like Houston and seen what chemicals in particular, or asbestos, do to these workers, and how little regard their employers have for their health, and how virtually every death is treated as some sort of just a tragedy that could not have been prevented, when you know as well as anyone, almost all of these deaths could have been prevented, these premature deaths from some of these chemicals. It continues to infuriate me, and I'm angry at my fellow journalists too. I don't know what it is, but people just don't seem to care about blue collar workers in this country. I mean, sure, if there's a plant explosion like BP in Texas City, 20 years ago now, it kills 15 people and injures 200 or whatever, yes, that'll be front page news. It has to be. But it's these sort of silent, invisible deaths that happen one by one. You know, some worker in a refinery or a chemical plant dies of leukemia at 55. You know, and nobody except it's usually a he, family or maybe some coworkers care. And the newspapers treat it as, again, just a tragic death. You know, Joe Smith died yesterday at 55 after 30 years working at the XYZ refinery. And that's it. They're treated as sort of, and so I continue to be attracted to stories about blue collar workers and how we do such a lousy job in this country of protecting them. And by we, I mean the federal government, OSHA in particular, the states, and of course the companies themselves. And a couple of examples, you had mentioned working in Lake Charles earlier in your career. So in 1998, when I was at the Houston Chronicle, I don't know how many trips I made to Lake Charles. And I produced a big series, and it was called In Strictest Confidence, which was a direct quote from a memo I'd obtained. That was about vinyl chloride, and I'm sure you know a lot about vinyl chloride.
Oh, yeah.
And how the PVC industry, the vinyl industry, had since the 1950s covered up the cancer risks of vinyl chloride. And I got a hold of a trove of documents, thousands and thousands of documents, got to know some of the workers over there in Lake Charles in particular, traveled to England, traveled to Italy, because PVC is so ubiquitous, and told the story of how this cancer hazard had been, there's no other term for it, covered up. That's an overused term. But in this case, I think it's absolutely accurate. So I spent a whole year on that. And the reaction to that, especially in places like Charles, was, really strong. Like, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe this company hid this stuff for 20 or 30 years. And then more recently, as you mentioned, I wrote a book. It's called The Cancer Factory. And it is about a chemical plant in Niagara Falls, New York, that made a chemical. It's a Goodyear plant. They don't make tires. They make a chemical that keeps tires from cracking, an antioxidant. And that plant opened right after World War II, 1946. It's still operating, barely hanging on, so it's still going. And that plant has produced, I think I've lost count, 80 plus cases of bladder cancer, specifically bladder cancer, that was tied to a particular chemical called orthotoluidine that was used in this tire antioxidant. And you go back and look, same as in Lake Charles, you look at what did they know, when did they know it, and you look at the science on that stuff. DuPont was the main manufacturer. A couple of other companies made it, but it was mainly DuPont. And DuPont knew by the mid-1950s that this stuff could cause bladder cancer, and they put their own workers, the folks who actually made the chemical in New Jersey, they put them in moon suits. And there was a no contact policy. This is in the mid-1950s. But when they sold it to their customers, including Goodyear in Niagara Falls, they neglected to pass along that information, So, and it finally came out, and so these bladder cancer cases, as you said earlier, there's the latency period. They don't happen overnight. And sure enough, starting in the early 80s, after some of these guys had been exposed for 20 or 30 years to this chemical, they start seeing bladder cancer cases, and they're asking each other, what's happening here? Is this 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're at 10, then we're at 20, and as I said, we're now upwards of 80. I don't know the exact number, but it was a totally preventable outbreak in this one. It's a pretty small chemical plant. It is not a big complex. And I got to know a bunch of the workers, their families, and so forth. And the sense of betrayal these guys, I hate to keep saying guys, but they are mostly guys, feel, knowing now what they do. They made good money. These were mostly guys who had not gone to college. They were living in an kind of a dying industrial town, Niagara Falls, and the jobs paid well, and they were not difficult jobs. They're not like making steel or coal mining. They weren't inherently dangerous, and so they would be soaked in these chemicals. Their arms and they'd go to work in shorts and T-shirts or T-shirts and jeans. This was in the 70s. You know how it was back then. The only thing, you wear your hard hat, but everything else was...
Sure.
And so this particular chemical, we know now, is a much bigger hazard through absorption rather than inhalation. So they were just, again, it would just soak into their skin, into their arms and hands and so forth for decades. And they were really happy with these jobs, and like put their kids through college, sometimes often for the first time in the family's history, and then they find out at age 55 or 60 or 65, oops, I have bladder cancer. So I'm going to keep. That's what that book's about. I want to do another book, probably out of Texas. I don't have it totally pinned down yet, but I just think workers are overlooked.
Yeah, let's talk about betrayal for a second, because that's the word that comes to mind a lot. And in me looking at some people may have seen the movie Dark Waters.
I did, yes.
Of course, people know Aaron Brockovich.
Yep.
And there are a few movies that get made that tell a story about this. And virtually every time you get into these industrial chemical cases, there's a huge cover-up that occurs for decades. The miracle, forever chemicals and the non-slip, Teflons and things like that. I think DuPont was in that one too, and
Yep.
it was they knew we know that they knew by at least the 50s, and oftentimes it goes back even before that, and it's not a one-off. This happens with, 3M will be found with something like this,
Yep.
DuPont, Dow, and you can go actually industry by industry, dry cleaning industry,
Yep.
And related things like that. And these chemicals they were all touted as miracle chemicals. And these chemicals are not, there are new chemicals being developed all the time. However, the start of this goes back to generally Germany, where I saw a big explosion was Germans were working at developing synthetic chemicals because they didn't have the same amount of resources as some of the other places did. So they got very creative about it, and they started developing all these chemicals. And then they were used in war purposes, and then they were used in industrial purposes, and then pretty soon everybody in the world is making these things, and they're all over the place. There is usually what I would say is enough notice way back when. If you even look at old German documents, they'll notice that people that worked closely or exposed closely with things would have health problems and even cancers.
And animal experiments.
And
too.
animal experiments, yes. And then somehow those things get kind of they get glazed over or paid for, and they don't surface. And then it just keeps going. And let's talk a little bit about the regulatory system. The process by which chemicals get formally studied to be considered carcinogens officially by the IARC or the EPA or these other groups or OSHA takes forever to do this. For one, if they're relying upon human studies, that takes a long time. And so it's the process of studying these chemicals is kind of ridiculous. There are how many hundreds of thousands now of synthetic chemicals that are they're multiplying every day.
Yeah, I've seen 80,000. I've seen 100,000.
Right.
Nobody really knows.
Right. So, when I was looking at this, I talked to people that were in OSHA and people that are talking in the EPA and in the scientific community. And I'm friends with people at the Ramsini Institute, which is a big workplace, occupational place, good people. And they go, well, the EPA, I think EPA finished their evaluation of this chemical TCE that's out there. They finished an evaluation of it and finally banned it this last year. Now that's been postponed.
Yep.
What I understood, and I'm just picking a chemical by name here, that was only the number 9 chemical that they gotten through. 9. They'd only done a comprehensive evaluation of 9 chemicals, and they started with the ones they considered to be the most hazardous. Mm-hmm. 9, okay, out of
tens of thousands
of chemicals. Okay, that's how far behind we are.
Yep.
And so when we're trying to rely upon standard regulatory stuff and standard scientific problem solving, we've got to get really streamlined and modernized here. And there may be some ways to start getting this fast-tracked with AI and science stuff working faster. Because it used to be there'd be a study in India or there'd be someplace in, another country, could be anywhere, but anywhere there was an industrial hub and medical people, they tended to have local people would be seen or they'd have some results. But these things were kept separate. And now they're not so much separate anymore, although industry still sequesters their own information, their own chemical testing. And it's very hard to crack into that because they conceal that stuff. They conceal that stuff with their internal documents and legal teams. And sometimes we see things marked confidential, highly confidential, don't disclose. We probably never see the best documents, the ones that are clear that says, oh, well, we know this is terrible. Although I have seen some pretty bad documents.
So have I,
yeah. How what's being done to track exposures, injuries, letting people know they have a possible injury, study them. What's being done to track all that?
Not very much. You're familiar with NIOSH, which, I guess still exists, barely, but has been gutted by the Trump administration. It used to do all those workplace, health and safety studies. That agency's basically no more. I mean, I suppose it exists on paper, but they were the folks, as you know, who would go into these workplaces, including Goodyear and Niagara Falls. In fact, they were one of the heroes of the story that I wrote about in my book. They and the union, and that's the other problem. The bladder cancer epidemic in Niagara Falls might never have been, discovered or made public if it weren't for the old OCAW union. I'm sure you dealt with those guys back in the old days. They were very aggressive and militant and, Tony Mazzocchi and very pro health and safety, more than most unions. So it took a combination of a very aggressive union and then this agency, NIOSH, part of the CDC that, again, has been gutted by the Trump administration, to blow this story out of the water, if you will, in Niagara Falls and expose this epidemic, and there's no other word for it, of bladder cancer in this workplace. But the scary thing is now, what's happened to unions compared to, say, the 70s, right? Unions like the OCAW, they're gone. They're part of the steelworkers now. But just union membership in general has plummeted over the last couple of decades. And without that as a backstop, what worker has got the guts to confront management about some dangerous process or some chemical, right? So you can imagine how many other situations are happening right now that we don't know about. No unions in many cases, and the agency that would investigate these workplace exposures, NIOSH, has been eviscerated. So, it may get worse, and as you said earlier, we won't know for decades, maybe. What's the next Niagara Falls going to be? What's the next Lake Charles going to be? We won't know until these cancers start piling up.
Well, there's cancers piling up all over Louisiana, and there's cancers piling up all over the ship channel for sure, and many other places. I've talked to people in many areas where there are cancer clusters of people, both in workspaces and also in environmental, neighborhoods, and most of those are considered unsolved or unproven. But it's kind of a thing where I've talked to many activists. A lot of them are moms, and they get very little support from anybody. The federal government, and I don't care who's in it. Okay, it varies from time to time who's in and how active they are, but I've never seen it where it's been a particularly helpful arena for the workers. I've never seen it where it's it's better than some, but it's never been that way. I view a lot of these plants, and I'm not against capitalism. I'm not against freedom of enterprise at all, but it's a power imbalance that is extraordinary here, that is dominated by money, and the corporations. As I said, the government's not going to save you, and the corporations aren't going to save you, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and now, because I think that the sort of one view is the empire is crumbling, okay, and we're in kind of a death throes situation where the chemical and plastics industries, for example. It's pretty hard. I mean, they're pretty embedded everywhere, and we're pretty dependent on synthetics and plastics and all these things. We're pretty. I mean, just every industry is dominated by it. Our cars, our planes, everything, our household things are made out of these things. And it's got a tremendous amount of momentum. And yet it is so obvious at this point that this is not sustainable. Particularly now, we're looking at, just now been popular the last couple of years, is the microplastics, right? Microplastics. This is not new. This is not new. This has been happening since we've had plastics. That they break down and they get in your body, and your body has a tough time getting rid of it. And so do animals, and so do fish, and so does the water. So it's not new. We're just hearing about it, but we're hearing about it rather deep into the problem. And so now we're dealing with the situation of, well, what do we do about this? This is obvious. I'm going, we know where the chemicals come from. We know where the plastics come from. There's a limited amount of companies that make them, and a limited number of companies that distribute them. It might be a big number, but we know who they are. And they're in everybody. And they're in every body of water and all over the place. So now, citizens, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, many of the petrochemical plants that are being built or expanded on the Texas coast ultimately produce chemicals that go toward the making of plastic around the world, right?
Yeah.
I don't think people make that connection, though. And that's one of the things we're going to try to do. As I mentioned, we're going to have a big piece with a lot of visuals toward the end of this year about the petrochemical boom in Texas specifically, and we're going to connect the dots between this ethane cracker in San Patricio County, Texas, let's say, and a bunch of plastic crap that ends up, in the oceans or in a landfill in Indonesia. People don't understand the connection, right, between what's going on, say, here in Texas and around the world. And it's just, so there's localized pollution for the people who are unfortunate enough to live next to these plants. They get these chemicals dumped on them in air, water. Greenhouse gases, we haven't talked about that at all. These are huge greenhouse gas emitters. So that's That's a planetary problem. That's not just a localized problem. And then on top of that, you add the plastic situation, which is already out of control. And it's our goal, not that we're going to change everybody's minds with one story, but that we start through, I hope, creative use of visuals and plain language, and not talking down to people, but not burying them in data and scientific language. I hope we can start to change at least some minds and wake people up, starting here in Texas with what's going on, and how what's going on in a place like San Patricio County, is affecting people thousands and thousands of miles away.
I see some solutions that are starting to emerge. They need support and they need to be scaled up. For example, I think you might have met these guys, the Regal Brew.
Oh, yeah.
These are young guys. They're in their 20s.
Right.
And they have developed a process of heat and certain enzymes and, things that will turn styrofoam into organic fertilizer.
I remember that, yeah.
I got to know them early in their phase, and they're true scientists and out there trying to do this stuff and basically kind of operating out of their garage, sort of, on no money. They just got a couple $1 million grant finally to try to start scaling this stuff, and they're taking on other plastic type of materials as well. So that's one guy. These people need support, okay? And you can find out about Regal Brew on our Truth and Justice League site. They're on there. They're featured in there. And we're going to be featuring more and more people that we consider to be everyday heroes. People out there that are doing things, and they need support. And people need to know that there are things that are happening, and there are benefits to this. There are also incredible scientific advances, some of which are true advances in making things that serve similar function to plastic, but a less toxic method. Things that break down. You see this from time to time. Used to be, and probably still is to some degree, these things are really got to fight hard to get seen, and really got to fight hard to be financed, and they're heavily suppressed. In the past, I hate to say this, but in the past, some of these really promising technologies get bought because there is a huge, huge cost to the big petrochemical industries, chemical industries, to changing the way business is being done. Because they are entrenched, it's cheap, it's easy, and they have these multi-billion-dollar refineries and plants all over the place. It's big, and they don't want to change.
No.
We've talked a lot about environment. We've talked a lot about workplace safety and the need for citizens to become informed and to become active. How do they find you at Public Health Watch? How can they support you, and how can they participate as community members?
Our website is publichealthwatch.org, which carries all of our stories as well as newsletters and other sort of inside, baseball stuff. They can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, which is just called The Watch. The Watch is usually a summary of either studies or government reports that most people probably missed, that were not on the front page of the New York Times. Some are environmental, some are other types of issues. It's very easy to subscribe to that newsletter, and each issue has, 4 or 5 items that I think are pretty well written and written in plain language, so that you can, at a glance, figure out what's happening with, if you're interested in toxic chemical like TCE or whatever, maternal mortality rates, you name it, we've covered the whole thing. And then from time to time, we haven't done it a lot, but we did it last year in Channelview, we have these town hall meetings, usually almost always in communities in which we have reported. We don't just show up somewhere. We go to communities like Channelview, rent out the local community center for an evening, and I'm talking about what we did last year. Invite everybody, not just, angry residents and environmentalists, but we invite industry people, we invite firefighters, anybody who has a stake in making a community safer. And if it's a Spanish-speaking community, we offer translation services. And so we did this last year, and we got about 100 people on a Friday night in January, which amazed me because we thought we'd be lucky to get 50. And we put some experts up on stage, some scientists, some doctors. We weren't there to brag about our own work, although one of our reporters was up there. We wanted to make experts available to regular people so they could ask questions. So some of them just wanted to vent. I can't believe they've been poisoning us here for 20 years. Nobody told us. Some had questions. So we're going to be doing more of those. We can't do that many of them because they're expensive and time consuming. Right. But the main thing is, subscribe to The Watch. Check in on our website, publichealthwatch.org, regularly. We don't publish stories daily. Usually we do longer form things, but, pop in every few weeks and then just follow us on the usual social media channels.
So I would like to wrap this up by addressing this question of what can I do, which we asked you a little bit about. But what I'm seeing is that this is an obvious issue that needs to be addressed for the well-being of humanity, period. It's not even a question. We are chronically dosed and we are getting sicker. So it's beyond obvious. It takes being aware of that, talking about it, but doing things about it. So what I recommend all of us do is to ask ourselves, what did I do for a fellow human being today that I feel good about? And what did I do for the earth today that I can feel good about? Just start with those two very simple things. And that's how momentum starts building. It starts with one little thing like that. But to also be aware that there are opportunities for change everywhere. This should be something that should be talked about in churches, that should be talked about in city council meetings, that should be talked about at neighborhoods. And this is something that next time you go have lunch or coffee with a friend, or you're at home, you're with your family, let's talk about this and ask people, hey, this is what I did today. What did you do today? And if you get a chance to serve on a jury, do it, because this is the backbone of it. If you get a chance to run for a political office, a small political office, do it. Be local. If you get a chance to, have a second volunteer job someplace where you can have some impact, do it. As it starts with us.
Totally agree.
Jim Morris of Public Health Watch, thank you so much for being here and talking about some stuff that is not very much fun to talk about, but really needs our attention.
Thank you for having me, Mark.